Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 7th of March 2024. I hope to rush this along a little bit, my last video was way too long. Let's get to where we normally start, military aid, military equipment section. The Biden administration is weighing whether it can tap around 200 million US dollars into from US Army funding to provide Ukraine immediate support as a larger aid package remains stalled in Congress. I think this will be part of the presidential drawdown. Remember, there are arguments about why haven't they spent it already. There's sort of $4 billion to use. That is an amount of money for the whole world to be spent over the whole year. And we're still at the beginning of the year, and so I think part of the reason why that hasn't been spent is that's all there is, and you spend that up front and you got nowhere to go. So they're going to be very careful about that. They don't know what's going to go on with Taiwan and blah blah blah. So it's not that 4.4 billion or whatever it is exclusively for Ukraine, even though it might end up being used in that way. That would be to defend why it hasn't been spent already. Obviously I'd love it to be spent right now. The White House is looking for other ways to help Ukraine while Congress procrastinates, according to John Kirby, National Security, the White House Security Advisor. Security Council member, whatever. However, he says there is no substitute for additional aid that has been stalled in Congress. That's it. Is that they will, and you can bet your bottom dollar the US will be trying to do all sorts of things: frozen assets, sanctions, this and that. Squeezing people's, twisting people's arms over here to say, can you guys do this, and we'll do a trade deal with you if you can get that kind of, helping Greece to get its equipment to Ukraine by saying, yeah, we'll sell you these F-35s or whatever. If we did, so the US will be putting loads of pressure on in other ways, other than giving its own equipment that it can't seem to do because Congress has stopped. And do you know what? Do I choose this point to do this? Right, I get people. John Boyd does this a lot in my comments, which is like, having a go at me, saying my sources are fake or whatever. He's pro-Ukraine, but staunch Republican to the point where everything's the Democrats' fault, right? My point back to people like that is, thank you for watching and thank you for supporting the channel in your viewership. But although you can argue that I'm just like defending the Democrats all the time and attacking Republicans, and I'll say to you, you're just attacking the Democrats and supporting the Republicans. What's the rhetoric that each side says? So tell me what the rhetoric of Donald Trump is with regard to Ukraine. Like, he has pretty much said he would cede territory to, and that's before you go into negotiations. So he's admitting he's going to do that up front to Putin. He's if you look at every single thing that man has said about Putin for the last 10 years, you tell me what the rhetoric is like coming from Trump. Like, that's all you need to know. So you can defend, MAGA Republicans all you like, but if that's what your main man is saying, you're on the wrong side there, mate. At least with regard to Ukraine. You might be that Trump says all the right things about it. I don't think he says anything particularly substantive. It's all vacuous attacks on the other side. There's no positive policy vision. But aside from that, what's the rhetoric from the people who are, what's the rhetoric from Marjorie Taylor Greene? What's the rhetoric from Matt Gaetz? What's the rhetoric from JD Vance? What's the rhetoric from Donald Trump? Are they at least saying the right? Because if they're saying, Putin is a real bad guy and this is terrible and we need to get aid to Ukraine and we need to get as much aid as possible to Ukraine, but we ain't doing that until the border's sorted, that would be somewhat explicable, and you could come to me with those criticisms. But these freaking idiots don't say that. They don't say that at all. They say, oh, we ain't getting any more aid to Ukraine. America first, border. But we are not up for supporting Ukraine. Zelensky is corrupt. This is happening. That is corrupt. That's Putin talking points. And so, don't come and criticize me for my positioning when your own side is positioning themselves in an alignment with Vladimir Putin, who is a dictator. That's all. I'm not talking that's what all Republicans. There's a lot of good Republicans that are saying the right things. Nikki Haley was saying broadly the right things, a little bit reserved, but broadly the right things. Right? That's where you need to be. But if you're going to support this approach just because he talks about closing down a border, and that for you colours everything, so therefore he can't be wrong on Ukraine. He can be wrong on Ukraine, and he is wrong on Ukraine. Zelensky and the headquarters showed us the importance of the port. This is Odessa being hit. This morning, if you didn't watch my first video, so he was talking to the Greek Prime Minister in Odessa, and it was hit by a missile only sort of 500 meters where they were. So Zelensky and the headquarters showed us the importance of the port and what is being done to restore and strengthen the Ukrainian sea route and what damage is suffered during the attacks, said Prime Minister of Greece. Already at the very end, we heard the sound of sirens and explosions that were very close to us. We didn't have time to go to a safe place. It's a very impressive experience. In other words, bang. And hopefully that means more support will come from Greece. Norway is to allocate $153 million for the purchase of ammunition for Ukraine. That's part of the Czech fund, I would have thought. Latvia has joined the Czech initiative to purchase artillery ammunition for Ukraine. This was announced by the Latvian defense minister. This is the most important opportunity to defeat Russia, and we must do everything possible to support Ukraine. And then Germany, who had already said yesterday with France that they were going to support the Czech initiative, has released new details. A government spokesperson announced today that Germany will invest a 3-digit million sum in the located 155mm ammunition. He did not yet want to give an exact figure. Czechia has collected the funds, basically. That means that all the funds are in for their 800,000 shells. Now, there's talk about there being actually 2 million shells that could be procured. It says it can acquire from overseas. Pledges by France, Germany, and Latvia in the last 24 hours have helped reach the target. We hope Ukraine gets the ammo it needs within weeks. Then we have Czech Defense Group. I think it's called Czechoslovak Group. CSG, I think that's what it stands for, has plans to invest hundreds of millions of euros. This is a massive defence concern, by the way, to establish joint ventures in Ukraine for the production of artillery ammunition and other heavy equipment. They hope to sign agreements this year, which is all really good news. And I think there is artillery ammunition getting through to Ukraine right now. So it then frustrates me that quite a prominent geopolitical strategist, Valina Chakarova, has said the EU failed on its promise to deliver 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine between March 2023 and 2024. After supplying only about half of the promised rounds, Brussels shifted the deadline to the end of this year. North Korea has sent more than 3 million artillery shells to Russia. And then all the people commenting under that are basically Russian trolls, right? It's just giving grist to the mill for them. Now, I actually disagree with this. I told you this before. Don't slam the EU for saying we pledged to give 1 million shells and then not being able to reach 1 million shells, because at least they pledged that. If they didn't say we pledge 1 million, just say we are going to up production and we're going to give as many as we can, no one would be complaining right now in the way that they are complaining now. They've been complaining about a lack of shells on the front line, but no one would be holding the EU to account. Putting that number on it just changes people, and then it gives them permission to criticise. But what the EU's done, I'm not trying to be totally pro-EU here, but you've got to understand that when 27 member states in a democratic union are reacting to a war, they're not going to react in a way that a single nation can react and just do things like that. But within the EU, you have bilateral commitments that means that there is that responsiveness from member nations independently. But from the EU as a whole, they've got to go through this process of 27 member states unanimously voting for X, Y, and Z. And what there is happening is that they have massively ramped up production. We are moving towards a substantial increase to the tune of multiple times what was being produced. Different companies have different situations, like 3 times what's being produced, 5 times, 10 times, etc., etc. And with the 800,000 shells, that is broadly the EU countries doing that. And they've now procured 800,000 shells pretty much like that by putting money in. So if that's not the EU saying they're going to deliver 1 million artillery shells, well, actually, and she says only half of it, actually, we don't know. There's some claims like maybe 600,000 plus, and actually this month of March is a month where it's all kind of happening. It could well be that by the end of March, it's 1.4 million shells. So, yeah, let's criticize, but criticize where it's actually practically useful to do so, or at least actually correct. I think with what the Czech has done, and you could say that's bilateral, but what do you mean by the EU? Is it part of the pledge? I mean, who cares? It's like European nations getting together, pledging this money, or pledging the money to invest in production, the ramping up of production to procure all this stuff for Ukraine. Ukraine has also bought 350,000 rounds off the EU. You can add that in, because that, you could argue that funding's come from the EU to buy stuff from the EU. Yes, US funding and other funding as well. But so this idea of this kind of like trying to have a go at the EU, I think is a problem. I'm actually quite impressed in how the EU's moved, particularly in the last month. Right, you could say that they were slow in the first part of the year. You also got to remember they've got contracts with all sorts of nations outside the EU for that same artillery ammunition. Anyway, I get from a high horse. I'm not trying to be pro EU. Just, be fair. European Union must launch the production of new generation weapons for victory on the battlefield. So this is the European Commission head, Ursula von der Leyen, who's just been, I think, voted in again. She said that Putin will bear responsibility for everything and that a courtroom awaits him in The Hague. Ouch. And I bloody hope so as well. Now, this is, again, in line with the military industrial strategy of the EU, possibly. The paper or the report came out, or the strategy itself came out yesterday or last couple of days, and I talked about that yesterday. I think the EU is going to be positioning itself in a much more robust military way going forward. And talking about Russian situation, I've talked about these sort of Nepalese and Indian troops who have, or just not troops, in some cases, tourists who have ended up on the front lines. The Guardian has written a whole newspaper article on this. He had no idea he was being sent to the war zone. The Indian and Nepalese men on front lines in Ukraine, signing up for jobs in Russia, Germany or Dubai. Young men have been made to join the Russian military, their families say. So, interesting article that details all of these people that have ended up on the front lines. I mean, some claims that 14 to 15,000 Nepalese have ended up in the Russian armed forces. I don't know if that's true, but this is an advantage Russia has in being able to steal people, but do this kind of crypto mobilization from abroad, swooping up all sorts of people to just throw into the meat grinder. Ukraine can't do that. They're fighting with their own. Yeah, they do get some volunteers. I think they need to revisit that idea of getting the International Legion more troops in it, and appealing to internationals to come to their aid. Anyway, move on to geopolitical things. Here we have David Cameron, the UK Foreign Minister, saying he wants the UK to loan Ukraine the money equivalent to frozen Russian assets on the basis of Russia paying reparations after the war. Wouldn't hold my breath, but okay. The UK's share of frozen assets is thought to be around $32 billion. Good development. This would be quite interesting. So of the predominantly, well, the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets, it appears that the UK has $32 billion. If we can give the Ukrainians that money and underwrite as a loan and underwrite that with frozen assets and properties and whatnot, then that seems a good workaround. There was a really good interview on Ukraine the Latest yesterday with a journalist who I think written a book as well on this. On, in particular, there's 15 to 16 properties in London that equate to £200 million worth of properties that the Russian Federation own. Literally, the Russian on the title deeds of the Russian Federation, and they are under diplomatic immunity. But these are properties that, they're going to be the odd embassy and houses and whatnot. But one, for example, is just a plot of land, and it's been challenged in court at the moment, and it's been challenged by some people who have won on behalf of Lukoil, who got aggressively taken over by the Russian government and have been sued by the people who owned it previously. This is how I understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong. But then have sued the Russian government and won, and keep winning against the Russian government, and they are owed there is £1 million worth of legal fees that the Russian government owes or whatever, and then this is being challenged again. I think they've won on this piece of land, and it's gone to appeal. And if the Russian government lose that, then that bit of land could end up going as kind of value, I guess, to these people, so on and so forth. The point is, there are different ways of doing all of this, and some involve confiscation. But if for example, British government started confiscating property off the Russians, then the Russians would retaliate with confiscating British property in Moscow and elsewhere. And so that's not something that governments particularly want. There are options you can take that would be quite officious, but you would end up being in more trouble than it's worth. But there are possibly other ways of getting around this, such as with some of these legal challenges, especially if they're not coming from the UK government, that could see Russian governmental property be sort of liquidated in and whatnot. But the other option, other than confiscation and changing hands with the property, is freezing it. But by freezing it, is basically nothing happens with it. It just sits there, unable to be used. The profits can't go to the Russians, and they can't use the property or whatever it might be, whatever the thing is, the asset is. But the UK government here, says David Cameron, could take the value of those frozen assets and say, well, look, Russia's not getting these anyway until they pay reparations. So we can lend the value of this stuff to Ukraine, and then if push comes to the shove, we'll just effectively confiscate this much further down the line as we'll hold on to it as collateral. Yeah, good stuff. Anyway. Or at least, interesting. Right, Czech and Slovak nations have split, or are appearing to be splitting over Ukraine, and that is causing some issues between those two nations. Prague has postponed, so Czechia has postponed consultations with Slovakia. The Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, on March the 6th, accused Prague of endangering Czech-Slovak relations by, quote, supporting the war in Ukraine, while Slovakia talks about peace. Fico made the statement in reaction to Czech Prime Minister Petr Fiala's decision to postpone consultations between the two countries that were planned for April. Fiala justified this by, quote, different opinions on key foreign policy issues. Initially supporting Ukraine on military and political levels, Slovakia's foreign policy took a sharp turn after populist leader Fico won the parliamentary elections last September while running on a Ukraine skeptic platform, and that was very much defended or amplified. The messaging of his platform was amplified by Russian disinformation, and Russia was very heavily involved in that election. And so, yeah, this challenging for that region. But I think Robert Fico needs to realise that actually he's on the outside, and you're going to be on the outside looking in. You're much better to be on the inside working with everyone else. France has invited Ukraine's allies and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to a video conference tomorrow. That's today. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba will also participate via video link. The purpose of the meeting is to formulate concrete proposals to strengthen support for Kyiv. The politicians will also discuss support for countries directly threatened by Russia, including Moldova. That's really important. So important they are on the agenda as well. I've said to you before that I think Emmanuel Macron is shaping up to be the leader to coalesce around with regard to support for Ukraine. There needs to be someone. I think there needs to be an individual human being that stands up. Now, I know Emmanuel Macron is not everyone's cup of tea, right? Both in France and abroad. But as a centrist and as a pro-European, I think he's probably politically in a useful position. And he's also the leader of a really big country that is able to, and that has a massive arms industry as well. I just think all the things point towards him being the rallying voice for Ukraine, as uncomfortable as that might be for people who don't like him, and there are a lot of people who don't like him. I'm kind of ambivalent. I can't see it being anyone else, and actually I want it to be him because I want it to be someone, and a French person would actually be better, I think, than a German or Polish person. They're much more geographically involved. If you have someone like France who's so central to Europe, like geographically, but also not so connected to that part of the world, I just think that could be more useful. Right, Germany strongly urges people not to travel to Russia, reports the country's foreign ministry. The decision was explained by the continuing deterioration of the situation, including an increase in the number of arbitrary arrests in Russia. The ministry said in a statement that there is a real risk of arrests of German citizens and people with dual citizenship. So things are hotting up. Asking Germans to get out of Dodge, I think, is an indication that relationship between Germany and and Russia on the diplomatic level is not going well. And I actually think, it sounds weird, but this is good news for Ukraine, because I think the more Russia and Germany don't get on, the more pro-Ukraine positioning will be facilitated, and the harder it will be for people like AfD who have that pro-Russian sentiment to find purchase. So that's my tuppence on that subject. So 23 people labelled as provocateurs by Poland's Minister of the Interior were arrested during a farmers' protest in Warsaw. In other words, there's a lot of people hijacking these so-called farmers' protests that were not farmers. You've got provocateurs from different political groups. Apparently, is it Confederation, the pro-Russian political party, very much involved with this? The Russians seem to have their fingerprints on these protests. Farmers clashed with police, injuring 4 officers. They want the EU to abandon its Green Deal and limit food imports from Ukraine, whilst at the same time saying nothing about food imports from Russia and Belarus that are coming through the Polish borders. So, make up your mind about that. Shashank Joshi, who's the Economist defense correspondent, who's very eloquent, I've seen him in select committee hearings as well. I like him. He's, the Economist. This is no left-wing rag, okay? This is the Economist, so it's like going to be centre-right. He's written for the Telegraph. He's written for a number of different papers, but he's not happy here with Mitch McConnell. So, and this does relate to Ukraine. So Mitch McConnell, I gave him some props earlier on in the war. I'm no fan of Mitch McConnell, but as a Republican, he stood up for Ukraine and for continued support to Ukraine. But he is kowtowed to Donald Trump. Why this is a problem is because this guy has no freaking backbone. Right? Donald Trump has personally insulted his wife, has personally insulted him. Mitch McConnell came out after January the 6th and laid the blame somewhat at the feet of Trump, and he's completely reneged on this because power talks, and no one has any moral fibre, it appears, in politics these days to stand up for what is good and right and stand up for ideals. It's all about these power plays and selling your soul to the devil. So Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell endorsed Donald Trump for president on Wednesday. Remarkable turnaround from the one-time critic who blamed the then president for disgraceful acts on January the 6th, 2021 Capitol attack. Shashank Joshi, the nod from McConnell, who has criticised Trump, this is quoting, as morally responsible for the 2021 mob siege of the Capitol, lends an imprimatur of institutional legitimacy to the indicted former president's bid to return to the White House. As Shashank Joshi says, all the stuff of January the 6th, all the stuff about Ukraine, all of it meaningless, hollow, insincere. Absolutely right. I go back to my original position on Mitch McConnell, is he's a spineless moral vacuum. To deplete Ukraine by stripping it, and why do I think that with regard to Donald Trump and his position on Ukraine? Again, like I said previously, it's about the rhetoric. Is what I said earlier in this video. Right, now listen to this. So to deplete Ukraine by stripping it of weapons and ammunition to bring it to the negotiating table with Putin is what New York Times journalist Bret Stephens has revealed in details of Trump's plan to, quote, end the war in 24 hours. So Trump has said very clearly that he could end the war in 24 hours. And then there's this talk about ceding territory to Russia, and then Zelensky's very openly said, well, if you know how to solve it in 24 hours, please let us know, because we'd like to do that. Unless, of course, the solving it is just giving giving Putin everything it wants. And anyway, in an interview with Sam Harris for his Making Sense podcast, Bret Stephens, a journalist who's citing people around Trump, so his advisors, said that this is exactly Trump's plan, and that is why Trump is prohibiting congressional Republicans from passing a new aid package to Ukraine. Having exhausted Ukraine, Trump hopes that Putin will end the war, retaining the positions he will have at the beginning of 2025. Now, this may not be true, but it seems true, and this is written by a journalist who is citing sources, but whether they're anonymous sources, yada, yada, yada. But this fits completely in line with what Trump has actually said on camera multiple times, right? He has not rhetorically come out and said he is massively in support of Ukraine and Ukraine needs to win this war and it needs to go back to 1991 borders. He's not said that one iota. So when you've got Mitch McConnell coming out and saying he's so strongly in support of Ukraine on the one hand, and then coming out and supporting Trump for presidency, it's just it just depresses the crap out of me. And you may be the biggest supporter of Ukraine, but if you're biggest supporter of Trump, but I don't know, and so many analysts have said this. I don't know how you can be a big supporter of Trump and a big supporter of Ukraine. If Ukraine is really, really important in your in your bubble of what is good and right and so on and so forth, I don't know that you could put Trump up on that pedestal. You can only do that if actually, I'm really in support of Ukraine, but it's not nearly as important as everything else Trump says. But you've got to remember that he says nothing of substance. He says stuff of invective. He calls people names. He slags people off. He does that very openly. He slags their family off. Like he's not a nice human. And he said, but as long as he says the right things about closing the border, but he had 4 years to do that. He didn't do it, right? So you can say what he likes, but what's his policy? Like, lay out your manifesto, mate. What do you represent other than like insulting people? What do you stand for? Because at the moment, all you're saying is like racist stuff, repealing bodily autonomy, so etc. etc. Like, but what's your actually substance? Tell me something about how you are going to run that economy. What's your foreign policy points? What are they? Just, solving something in 24 hours. It's meaningless twaddle. Meanwhile, the head of Gagauzia, the autonomous region Moldova, has gone and met Putin. And Moldova is being torn apart, rent asunder from the inside. I wonder what Trump would think about that. He probably doesn't know where Moldova is. I informed Vladimir Vladimirovich, so Putin, about the lawless actions of the authorities of Moldova, who are taking revenge on us for our civic position and loyalty to national interests. You're loyal to only one thing, and that's Putin. According to her, Putin promised to support Gagauzia and the Gagauz people in defending our legitimate rights. Gagauzia is known for its pro-Russian sentiments. Of course it is. Right. Meanwhile, Putin has said in his revisionist history lessons that he gives, where Poland was responsible for World War II. So you got Soviets who historically hate the Nazis and hate Germany, but now it seems that it's okay to just blame Poland, as he did in his interview with Tucker Carlson, and Poland got the blame for starting World War II. And now he's saying Putin's new geopolitical discovery is, he said that Belgium, to a large extent, appeared on the world map as an independent state thanks to Russia. What are you talking about, you absolute pillock? Anyway, sorry, it's been a long day already. I've done too much talking. I still don't have my cup of tea. Russian and Belarusian tennis players have been allowed to participate in the Olympics and Paralympics in a neutral status. The decision was made by the International Tennis Federation. Screw you, International Tennis Federation. The decision states that they must be selected under general conditions and meet the requirements of neutrality. However, it does not specify the possibility of competing in a doubles tournament. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Go and check out I have put it finally up today. Because most of the members have watched it, and they said a lot of them said just put it out anyway. I put out my quasi documentary thing for everyone to watch. 10 Days in Ukraine, Part 1. How did we get here? Hopefully you like it. It seems to have been met with pretty good feedback from the members, so I'm really happy that people appreciate it. It took a lot of time and effort. Yeah, so go and check that out and see what you think. Take care, speak soon.